Hello everyone, today we talk about the cultural role of Islam at the turn of the second millennium of our era. So this is, as usual, it's a pretty broad topic, pretty manualistic if you want, but it's still very important. As you know, on Schwerpunkt I have my um, playlist about medieval Islam essentially, and I'm recently I've been talking a little bit about this. My topics are rather not really cyclical, but it happens to address, given especially the number of videos I make, say certain topics that sound the same, they're actually not, because I always choose um, some different side of the story, some looking at different shades, always trying to give a broader picture and giving a dimension to it, because this is essentially the point. And naturally, as a medievalist, I feel the need to observe how really overlooked medieval Islam is, and I realize it's full of people out there. Every time I make a video that is either about, I don't know, Christianity or Islam, they immediately think I have some kind of agenda for it. Like, I'm accused rarely, but I think this is kind of a structural rate of anything and its contrary. I would like to point out on Schwerpunkt, I can tell you I don't make any form of ideology, because ideologism is by a certain extent of how our human brain works, because we need to fix certain concepts and basically to make at least our explanations, discussions are revolving around it. But you can be sure that from Schwerpunkt I will never be here to push, say, any form of ideology as such. I mean, I don't care, because when I discuss history, which, as you please, and if you are a regular follower, you probably realize I do it at a very sometimes generalist way. Generalist, I think it's the best term I can use, because it's not really simplistic, it's not really superficial, at least obviously it can be if you take certain standards. Obviously here I'm not keeping academic standards, also because for academic standards we should talk only about things we're personally expert on, and I rarely addressed such topics on Schwerpunkt. So I'm kind of making taking a broader look at especially medieval history, as you have understood. I'm actually sorry recently I didn't make a lot of videos about military history, because I'm actually preparing a video on the campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria during the Peloponnesian War. I'm taking a bit of time because I'm actually running out of time, and making this more, let's say, these simpler videos, it's a way to make mass talking about decently enough, let's say, in terms of quality, about something for a prolonged time. But going back to the point, I think there is a tendency, I'm not saying in our Western world, nor in others necessarily, to, also because I don't know much, and I despise such wild approximations, but at least there is a tendency to think at, I don't know, at medieval history sometimes from a strictly, I can say, localistic perspective, or because that can also assume other meanings, but let's say trying to imagine the Middle Ages as, a series of different compartments. So the idea that, I don't know, Christianity was from one side, Islam was from the other, and that was it. The Middle Ages is probably this moment of huge hybrid that existed among these cultures, and to tell it fully all, it doesn't make a freaking sense in the first place to study the European Middle Ages ignoring medieval Islam. And this is something you acknowledge ever since you start studying real history, that is essentially looking at the whole perspective, not just getting interested in this or that little tiny thing. And I will try to make my best to bring, say, this perspective in, because for many people this is simply political. many people say, oh, this guy is pushing an agenda because, I don't know, he wants, I don't know, he's pro-Muslim immigration in the West, he wants to crumble. It doesn't make any freaking sense. I'm discussing about these topics because I understood their importance while studying medieval history, and I simply want to get a realistic picture. So I realize, I say this to be honest also for a more pragmatic reason, that is, I realize that there is this kind of aversion, that this kind of influences also the way people look at my channel. And actually proud of this because I've seen that there are lots of, even of Muslim followers I have. So since I know actually relatively a few about the Islamic world myself, I think that it's amazing that there are people who follow me in this sense also from and appreciate things I'm talking about. And the point is not really here about even making a dichotomy Christianity and Islam. The point is really looking at the whole thing, how it really was, and not pushing for any form of, I don't know, of differentiation based on an opposition, let's say. Because if you look at the history, also if you stick to the European perspective of the Middle Ages, you realize that whereas the same Europeans that were hungry of knowledge for things that were coming from the East, and when taking them and reading them, and studying them, and absorbing them, so showing not just a progressed interest. So medieval Europeans were wildly fascinated with Islamic culture and Islamic civilization. So this kind of, I don't know, communitarian perspective for which, I don't know, everybody in Europe at the time was in his tiny fans. And by the way, this is also the point that this happens also within the same Europe. There are people who think about Middle Ages just from that strict, I don't know, national perspective, thinking that, I don't know, their country was somewhat, you know, a monad that existed in there and didn't have any input from anywhere else, didn't have any form. This can be extended. A broader historical point of view can argue that also Western civilization definitely was triggered by the same rising civilizations in places like Mesopotamia and in Egypt, because it's actually the truth. And this doesn't mean that, you know, that we have also to make a scale of civilizations, because this is another point that I'm not really interested in. I mean, theoretically, you could even start a debate about this. For instance, today we will notice, given today's topic, that the Islamic world around year 1000 was much more advanced, culturally speaking, technologically speaking, than the West. So these are observations that should let us understand how things evolve, not because we have to look at the past because of our, I don't know, football team that has to score because we feel better about it today, but rather because there is a story of how things happened that we should stop coloring with any form of color, any form of, you know, of circumscribed identity that we perceive as such, because every individual is freaking different, and there are different, naturally, groupings you can make for the sake of, you know, more or less defining what we're talking about. But if you, the deeper you go into history, and the more you realize that especially cultural influences are something extremely difficult to, not to track, but let's say to say, okay, this begins here and it stops there. It was a continuum. And I'm now, probably some of you will say, well, this premise was unnecessary because it looks as it sounds as if you kind of need to make an excuse for talking about these topics. No, it's really not. I just bump randomly into the topics I have to discuss every day. I noticed recently I did similar videos, videos about similar topics recently. So some of you might say, oh my god, that, are you going to that direction? Not really. I'm just this is completely random. But it's still important to explain why I choose these topics, because otherwise Schwerpunkt wouldn't probably make sense. I'm waiting for my number 300 video to make, as by tradition now, kind of an explanation of how things work on this channel and how it's progressing. So we'll see that hopefully in April, if I manage to arrive to such a number. So for now, we just begin this one. Excuse me, I drink a little as usual before starting to talk. So one, there are many premises also. If you're interested about the topic, however, of medieval Islam, that is definitely fascinating. Maybe one day we'll advise you a decent introductory bibliography. But definitely my medieval Islam playlist, now it counts 16 videos, starting to get rather consistent. I've made several videos about general Muslim history. Sometimes it's not even strictly about that, because I came to discuss essentially military history of Muslim powers, like the Ottomans, the Mamluks, and so on. But there are also general videos about, especially the importance of Arab culture in the West. Also in medieval society playlist, I've done recently several videos about the translations from Arab, from Greek, even and generally speaking, talking about this influence. There's even certain comparisons. I made a video about the Carolingian Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate, compared. On the expansion of Islam, made also that this could be useful for looking at this as an introduction to this video. 9th to 12th century Islamic thought, Mu'tazilism, Ismailism, and Sufism. That was also rather interesting. So looking at broadly at this perspective, and not just, and because I will be repeating also certain thoughts without a next explanation, so that's why also I advise you to look at one video or another. So one important point that we haven't still touched quite into detail is a very important concept, telling the truth, that at the turn of the second millennium of our era, of the Christian era, Islam was actually pretty much fractioned from a political point of view. This is probably one of the most important things to fix in mind when discussing the Muslim world, because it is true for those times as much as today. Sometimes there are, certain interpretations, at least if you look at from, once again, I hate to say it, but from our Western perspective, we sometimes tend to generalize, to flatten everything, to homogenize everything. You say, okay, that's the Muslim world, it's as if it was a unique thing. Obviously, I think everybody knows that this is not true, even if they want to force the approximation for some reason. But it's also very important to understand from a strictly historical perspective, and especially looking at this point, because you know that the Islamic invasions have been, the early Islamic invasions at least, have been extremely fast and rapid, and they became to encompass territories that stretch from Portugal to India in a very few generations, and therefore expanding this Islam that was pretty much, at least initially, a compact thing. Also in here it's an approximation, but what I care about saying is that eventually all this Islamic world got fragmented from a political point of view. So the ideal of the caliphate, it was essentially a universal, it was conceived as a universal power, with the rule of God through the caliphs, essentially. That is also something slightly different from the, not slightly, actually radically different from the there are naturally comparisons with how political theory was conceived into the Christian world or in the Jewish world. Eventually got fragmented. And there is a myth that is essentially that Islam, by conquering all these territories of the Byzantine and Sassanid East, let's say, they brought to a sort of unification of those lands that had been so wildly fragmented before. Actually, this is completely false, because if you look at the map of the Near East, since the very first empires and civilizations, you realize that more or less at all times it was a kind of, I can say, an hegemonic power there, but there were massive empires that kind of remained also for many centuries, and that even when they were fighting one against the other, like with Rome and Persia, they were substantially two big blocks that more or less had a unitary character within themselves. With all, naturally, also in here all the approximations of the case, but this is in relative terms, and in relatively to what? Relatively to what happened eventually with Islamic conquest, because Islamic conquest basically brought to in a few generations to an irreversible fragmentation. But also here it's very difficult to telling the truth, not maybe extremely difficult to explain, but that has to start from the obvious consideration that basically the Arabs were a very few, demically speaking. They might have been definitely a highly militarized society, so they kind of resemble this kind of peoples on the march, initially speaking. But let's be honest, these were tribesmen from the Arabian deserts that came to occupy some of the most advanced and densely populated and wealthiest lands of the known world. Lands like Egypt, lands like Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, that all had their own elites. The ancient world, if you want to stress the fact that Islamic invasions brought an end to it, was essentially ruled by elites. There were big empires that had also a relatively high degree of centralization, like the Roman one, the Sassanid one, but that substantially were still ruled locally by certain elites. And what you see in the evolution of Muslim history in the early Middle Ages is that substantially there was not an homogenization. There was definitely the export of essentially only two things. For the rest, this was completely different in everything. The two things were Arab language and Islamic religion. These were the only common factors that existed there. Because if you look at these Muslim powers that came to form into Baghdad, into Cordoba, into Cairo, and so on, you see that there were essentially regional powers. Baghdad was located into which every other harbor of every other Mesopotamian civilization was created. Cordoba was in Spain, so exploiting the overlapping more or less with the Visigothic kingdom, or at least this extremely intensely Romanized area of southern Spain. Cairo was naturally in Egypt, that also was the harbor of another millenary civilization. Even in Tunisia, there was a kind of say national, we can say proto-national kind of identity that existed in there, also in there from Roman times, from a certain also infrastructures were very important from this point of view. So there were many centers that today we also give a look to some of the most peripheral ones you never talk about, because actually everybody knows about Baghdad or Cordoba or Egypt. But there were so many other Muslim principalities all over the Muslim world that had their own, there were capitals on their own. And what is very important to stress is that paradoxically, by the turn of the second millennium BC, the Arab world was kind of declining in some ways, because there were now new populations that were essentially pouring in. And however, there was still this perspective, was a differentiation based. And Persia, by the way, I was forgetting about it. Persia was another dramatically important center, that arguably had nothing to do, in fact, with the Arabs, culturally speaking, but became one of the greatest centers of Muslim culture, and especially many, and we'll see also today, many of the various of the greatest thinkers of the Muslim world in medieval times, certain of the greatest minds of human history actually were that also worked, find their jobs into the Abbasid Caliphate. So theoretically, what has still to be the center of the Muslim world. It was a bit like the Holy Roman Empire in the West. It didn't encompass. It was mostly a German thing. It theoretically had to encompass everything. Also here it's kind of a weird comparison, but so it is. Here also the Caliphate of Baghdad had to encompass theoretically everything. Also, even if in the West there was just one empire, instead, and in the Muslim world there were several caliphates that all claimed their kind of imperial title on their own. So it's a bit like in the Christian world, you take the Byzantine Empire. This is a better, actually, a much better similarity. I was making an example just with the West, but explaining that, well, at least the Byzantine Empire had kind of a greater unity. Also, the Caliphate of Baghdad was enormously influenced by the Byzantine Empire and its imperial models, etc., but also from the Sasanian ones, so from the Persian ones. So Persia was this extremely fertile ground for scholars, for great thinkers. It all had kind of almost an Iranian origin. Another datum is that this what is the point? Is that this fragmentation definitely contributed to weaken the Islamic world as a whole. So, if you look at it in historical perspective, the early medieval Muslims failed to give the what they call the Dar al-Islam, so essentially the whole Muslim world, as not even as a physical, geographical world, but as a kind of a, wherever there was Islam, spiritually speaking, a political unity. Also in here, Islamic political theory is very complex. It's much more problematic. There are certain genetic characters of Islamic political theory that are actually weakening authority. The West, Christianity worked in a very different way, but this is not maybe the time to explain it. I've hinted at it in other videos actually. So, if you want, there was a general failure of the Islamic civilization to shape something greater, given especially the extremely speedy process for which Islam had first expanded into the 8th century, the 7th and the 8th century. The expansion. The geographical expansion proper actually finished around the first half of the 8th century. There was another, however, one of the results that we're gonna concentrate on today is, however, that this political fragmentation. Excuse me, I put myself at ease a little bit. Is that this political fragmentation actually gave an enormous impulse to cultural production, and especially conferred the Islamic world as an extraordinary mediator, an extraordinary medium that was able to re-elaborate originally and to essentially produce a new synthesis, especially under a scientific and more generally cultural point of view. We can't stress this enough, and this happened also naturally in other times in history. Sometimes it's difficult here to trace comparisons because Islam kind of expanded in a quite peculiar way, but let's say that as we said many times on Schwerpunkt when discussing, especially the early Islamic invasions, the Arabs were extremely open-minded at the time. There were as many, if you look, this is kind of a paradox. The primitive peoples, this happened in the West also with the Germans, telling the truth, are extremely less resistant, culturally speaking, to integration, to absorption, to inclusion. If you come from a world that is already very structured, has a certain certain canons, certain dogmas, certain thought, because they correspond to a very structured society, it's going to be enormously more difficult for you to change your mind, as long, especially as you live into that society, because actually humans are quite flexible minded, but there is going to be more resistance. I mean, until that society doesn't change or crumble, because in history such things happen too, it's going to be extremely difficult for that culture to even absorb external influences at an essential point of view. More primitive peoples might take maybe a while before getting, fully acquainted with all the let's say, with the peaks of other more developed societies, but at the same time they're much quicker to get the essentials and to adopt them and to put them together also from other civilizations. This is what the Arabs did. The Arabs got essentially in a few generations to dominate over some of the most developed lands of the world at the time, essentially seizing some of the largest libraries that existed at the time, to interact with some of the most intellectually advanced scholars of the time. And they got it all together, and they managed in a few centuries essentially to produce the most advanced civilization of at least Western Eurasia. And this is an extraordinary process. So, as we were saying before, it's very easy to talk about Baghdad or Cordoba or Cairo. And if you look at, also here we could make an endless list of the various madrazas, for instance, or the immense libraries that existed in these centers of the Islamic world. And the importance of libraries was enormous in the Islamic world. Obviously, there was a lot of Hellenistic legacy in here. The Muslims had enormous. They had essentially public libraries. They had libraries associated to the madrazas, to hospitals also. Sometimes, the madrazas would be essentially the schools of Islamic law, essentially. So of religious and juridical studies, we can say. And these were in fact extremely important. I mean, the Europeans at this time didn't have universities. At least they had different teaching educational centers. These madrazas are sometimes extraordinary. Sometimes extraordinary architecture. They even when they were not associated to mosques, because this could also be as buildings, they had their own minarets that also had extremely elaborated gates and so on. So all symbolisms that now we can't get into detail, but all related naturally to Islamic religion. These libraries, there could be an endless list of them, telling the truth. especially during the 10th century was the 10th century was probably some moment of greatest peaks of Islamic expansion from a cultural point of view. It was a huge amount of libraries as schools were built everywhere, literally. Think about Basra, Isfahan, Nishapur, Rai, Damascus, Cairo, etc. The In Abbasid Mosul there was a large library called Kizanat al-Kutub. These were all centers that naturally were developed a bit thanks to the same political fragmentation I've seen before, because obviously the local societies conquered by the Muslims were we've seen it already rather active and rather evolved from a cultural point of view, but naturally there was a process of kind of stratification also in the Muslim world, with the shaping of these local essentially monarchies that started to expand also the local bureaucracy and the centers of power. So these libraries were really a great strategic asset also to attract scholars, new thinkers, people who could work into the bureaucracy to make things work. And this was extremely functional, to tell the truth, because as we've said before, there were many people, extremely gifted thinkers, that came from also the outskirts of the Muslim world, from areas where in comparison relatively more depressed, that found some of the greatest jobs at the time in these main centers. But there are so many other centers that we can't see before. For instance, there is one of the oldest libraries in the world is the one of Al-Farabi was established in 859 in Fez, in Morocco. And by the way, many of these foundations were also started by women, because these were essentially making a sort of these libraries was conceived as a form of charity. This came from donations, that in the Islamic world the charity donations are they're a duty of the Muslim, actually. There was the extremely famous Baitul Ikma, the House of Wisdom of Baghdad, that was, founded by the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and eventually reaching its apex under his son Al-Mamun, Caliph Al-Mamun, kind of together with Charlemagne, one of the greatest figures of the time. There will be a lot to talk. Maybe one day I will make a video only about medieval Muslim libraries, because it is an extremely fascinating topic and extremely important to discuss. What else can we say about it? Which other... Excuse me, because there is this noise. I would like to keep my windows open, but I'm disturbed by the noise. Wait a second. So many other naturally, there were several libraries also in the same centers, by the way. The same Baghdad saw the rise of many other centers, sometimes also in certain districts that were forming around the city and that were growing in importance. So the rise of this center were lots of libraries also in Cairo. These had huge importance. There is the Mahmudiyya library that was extremely important in Iran, in Persia, as we've seen. The There were also many others, like the library of Abu Al-Farabi ibn al-Amid in the city of Shiraz. These were Some were being born, as we've seen, also as private libraries, or private foundations. This is also very important, because this witnesses also the interests that these libraries had for privates, even to obviously augment their power, their prestige, their clienteles, etc. But there are so many others in Persia, aside from the library of Shiraz, like the one of Tus, the one of Mashhad, that was established around 974. In Syria, there were lots of libraries that sometimes were in continuity, especially in there, with local Byzantine juridical traditions. You think that especially Lebanon had been one of the greatest centers of juridical studies in the Byzantine times. There is the Library of Tripoli in Lebanon. This was a major center of learning at this was actually an area that was under Fatimid, the influence of Fatimid caliphs at the time in Cairo. There was the library of Aleppo as well, and a very important one. The one of Samarkand and Bukhara. Now we'll talk about Samarkand and Bukhara in more detail. These were founded actually a bit later in time. Unfortunately, this library is developed especially also for other reasons. For instance, when Baghdad was destroyed by the Mongols in 1258, a lot of books moved to Samarkand, were saved, fortunately, by the destructions. There is the library of Ghazni in Afghanistan. This was at the time of the Sultan Mahmud, at the end of the 10th, beginning of the 11th century. Ghazni's library was essentially considered one of the best in the world at the time. At the time, the city of Ghazna was extremely important center, as was the capital, in fact, of the Ghaznavid Empire that stretched to India. We discussed that also when we talk about Muslim India in the Middle Ages, the Ghaznavid invasions of India. Talking about Spain, the Lubna of Cordoba was the director in 1994 of a library with 400,000 volumes. You can imagine even the size, the volume of such libraries in the 10th century. There is also today, actually, in the Escorial Palace, there is an extremely large collection of Islamic manuscripts. These were part of the paradoxically the books that the Spanish preserved, while the Inquisition kind of got rid of all the things at the time, and so to witness also the interest that still existed at this time in the Renaissance, the 16th century, for these Muslim works. India had also Muslim India, that the Sultanate of Delhi had extremely advanced libraries also in Mughal times, but today we stop essentially to the modern age. So for making you understand how wide and developed this world really was. And as we were saying, there were also other centers that are a bit overlooked compared to the more famous, say, Islamic capitals. So looking at a little uh, look at these centers, for instance, some of them we just named, and Bukhara. Bukhara was a very important city, a city of Transoxiana, on the lower Zarafshan or Zarafshan, I don't know, river. The interesting thing about Transoxiana was its proximity to the trade routes it brought to China, so that the name of Bukhara actually is mentioned also into the Chinese sources. The 7th century, even though the city was much more ancient than this, and the name of Bukhara comes from probably from the Sanskrit vihara, that means there would be a cluster essentially, and the Turkish Mongolic tongue brought to in the form of Bukhar. So this was actually a Buddhist cluster, originally speaking. This is also something you have to bear in mind. Extremely, when thinking not just of Islamic times, also pre-Islamic times, how many different religions coexisted into this area. In the mountains of Afghanistan, if you take Bactria, I don't know, those were Buddhist places. Bactria was a Buddhist power back in the day. There was this extreme contact with centers like India, like China, centers of culture. I mean, so when Islam expanded into these areas, it absorbed all of these influences and before, and these were areas that didn't have really always at all times a centralized asset, but definitely Bukhara was one of the most important centers in at the time, and it kind of dominated the stories of the region, and it was in fact very often the capital of it. And in fact, when at the beginning of 16th century, it also became the capital of the Uzbek Khanate of Bukhara. In fact, it eventually became an emirate, then eventually in the 19th century was conquered by the Russians when they invaded the Turkestan. And this has, the history of Islam in this area is even kind of obscure, because we don't really know. I mean, before Islamic times, what was really much about the city, and definitely this was an area that had been inhabited by the Sogdians, the Iranians, was conquered by Alexander the Great, ruled by the Seleucids, and then being into Bactriana, that there had been Zoroastrianism in this place, and it was actually the Turkish Mongolic invasions that in part introduced Buddhism in the area. Brought them there. So, and these were extremely, say, tolerant lands. There was a coexistence of several communities of various, and this was a bit of a tradition of the Persian Empire. And telling the truth, when the Persians began even to persecute certain dualistic sects, this center became a kind of refuge for all these all these people, and the Sasanians and eventually the Nestorians were also accepted here under the Persian domination. That the Nestorians had this enormous influence all over Asia at the time of the early medieval times. China got Christianized in part by that, and so on. So it was a very important crossroad. And there were at the same time several populations of Turkish stock that eventually were fighting against each other. These were, I think Bukhara was occupied, at least its area, by the White Huns, and eventually they they were once again they were in turn kicked by another Turkic people that ruled into Bukhara, actually even after the Muslim conquest, the Muslim expansion, at least, so the conversion to Islam. And the Khorasan came, so with its capital of Merv, came to dominate in this area, but it progressively also shrank as a power, and at this time Islam was flowing to Bukhara, into this center, and this was also a Samanid center into the 10th century. Bukhara, together with Samarkand, were essentially flourishing in this period as centers of art and religious studies. There were also very complicated, say, political changes, but the city maintained its splendor throughout all the of the city. And so probably the history of Transoxiana is the history of a frontier, if you want, because there were so many powers. Like even when the Seljuks arrived, this was the year of fights between the Ghaznamids, the Seljuks, extremely complicated areas, and this center was so important that it kind of always remained sort of centralized. They were vassals of the Karkhanids. They always were able to maintain kind of its own power in many ways. So many different dominations also that brought several influxes that enriched the center. The decline arrived kind of during the 13th century, when the city began to lose importance. It was taken by the Mongols and sacked, and eventually under the Timurids, until, as we've seen, the Uzbek conquest. So, if you want, also pretty tormented history, but nevertheless, a center that definitely had its fortune, because exactly in part because of this continuous dynamism. It also stimulated the local communities to interact with so many different cultures, so many different rulers, and therefore having to refine their skills in this sense. Another very important center, as we have seen it now, it was Samarkand. So today it's in Uzbekistan, and this also this is a center, as many others, that rose over the shores of the Zervshan River. So in this extremely fertile valley to which this river flows, and its history is also in here pretty amazing. It's one of the most culturally important cities of Central Asia. It was the capital of Sogdiana in Achaemenid times, and after the conquest of Alexander the Great, it was part of the Seleucid Empire, and eventually of the Greek Scythian kingdom of Bactria. And the Arabs conquered Samarkand in 712 AD. And also in here, they, just like we've seen with Bukhara, they kind of begin to leave this city with a decentralized government. This had always been the case. Basically, there have always been these empires that were settled either in Mesopotamia or in Persia, that looked at the north, at these plains of Turkmenistan, of Uzbekistan, and that were also very exposed to the nomads of the steppes, and that kind of left them a bit on their own, because it was also difficult to control them. These were also relatively difficult territories, but these were, and this is what a few people know today, that these areas north of the Iranian plateau at the time, during the Middle Ages, were some of the most densely populated and most developed areas of the world. The city of Merv, for instance, was allegedly at a certain point the most populated city of the world during the Middle Ages. This is often overlooked, like saying, "Oh well, there's never been anything there." No, because these were all centers were flourishing a bit because of this structural local, agricultural resources, these rivers and these very fertile plains, but also as trade centers between China, the Middle East, and Europe. So also in here, when the Arabs conquered Samarkand, they left a local Turkish dynasty to rule. And Samarkand actually had a moment of splendor under the Mongols that culminated under Tamerlane, Timur, the Lame, that actually shifted his capital in there, and he was buried also in there when he died in 405. There was the nephew of Timur also built an astronomy center in here, observatory. This was also very important. All these areas had always developed a great interest for astronomy, and then the Mongols were also very keen on, because kind of the world of the steppe really was very much interested into astronomy and cosmology as much as the actually the sedentary civilizations. This is because of also religious questions that also predate the conversion to. They have to do with animism and the relation that with the celestial deity that is in this steppe is kind of the central figure. And so these areas kind of, the Mongols were extremely keen on astronomy slash astrology, by the way, because it was the same thing at the time. And they everywhere they went, they developed these observatories that were already in part existing. The shifting towards the west and into Africa, there are also two other very important centers, respectively in Tunisia and in Morocco. There are Kairouan and Marrakech. These were also very important into centers into the Islamic West, together with Cordoba, naturally. And there was a great, this is another important thing of this Islamic world at the time, is that there was a very strong connection between all of these centers. These were all, especially the juridical schools of Islam, were extremely, they were the channel through which there was a great communication between Arabia and, in fact, Persia and Spain, North Africa, Mesopotamia. There was a very Syria. There was a very great contact. So you can imagine how this favored, and in part was still also the effect of trade, as the Mediterranean now was opened. Open not just in the contact between the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean, but also between these areas of the Islamic world that from one side and another of the Mediterranean were actually pretty much in contact the one with each other. So all thoughts and knowledge that was flowing around its centers. Kairouan, so, is this city in Tunisia that is located roughly 50 kilometers from the eastern coast of Sahel. It actually emerges over a almost desertic plain. and it had a huge importance at this point. When the Arabs arrived in Tunisia during the first invasions, we have the knowledge it was already a Byzantine stronghold in this place. It was known as Kamuniya or Kuniya. So, however, there is no evidence that before the Arab invasion there was a center there. Of some sort of academic center in there. So, according to tradition, the Kairouan was founded 50 years after the Hijra, so in 670 AD, by Uqba ibn Nafi. That is one of the heroes of the Muslim conquest of Africa. Early Islam put an enormous emphasis on the importance of these figures that had somehow achieved these feats of either conquest or expansion, all kind of a still mythical past, because this is still a very early age, and even from a historical point of view, it's very difficult to, aside from the Muslim tradition that has largely been built also in later times, what the thing really was. And this site of Kairouan was chosen to found a new city because it had a certain strategical importance, as basically it was easily connected to the region of Tripolitania, and it was a kind of an avant-post towards the to the northern territories, let's say the highly Romanized Berber regions of northern and south, and western Africa. So this is where Kairouan was built, and it was mostly a military center. It was built also in here, or rebuilt, depending on what the continuity with the Byzantine stronghold was, but probably it was as a military center. And this was important because the city was technically still exposed to a possible Byzantine reconquest from somewhere, and this center was very important to start the conquest of our surrounding regions by the Muslims. So this center was eventually fortified, and a mosque was built in there. And it was a moment in which this city could have, however, stopped its expansion, because Kuba was recalled back in the east, and eventually he came back. So Kairouan grew to be the capital of the Ifriqiya. So this essentially the Arabization of the name of the ancient Roman Africa. That was in fact modern days Tunisia, roughly, and eastern Algeria. So this is important because from this point onwards, Kairouan remains the residence of all the governors were sent by the Umayyad caliphs of Damascus first, and of the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad later. This was a frontier area as well, so it's interesting to look at these minor centers also because of their relation with the surrounding and still not Muslim populations, as the local Berbers didn't really much like the Islamic invasion. So they tried to counter. This had been always the problem whoever had been there. Also, the Byzantines had to struggle with the Berbers before. And also in here, however, it's important that Islam begins to flow because certain of these Berbers were converted to Islam now, so kind of entering into the game of the local elites and so on, because this was the point. But they were assuming another, they were siding with another interpretation of Islam, that is the heresy of the Kairouism, and that had actually spread into the East, but now was had originated in the East, but was being spread in the West, and embraced by these Berbers, even as kind of now of national. It's a bit like the Aryanism among the Germans in Europe. Kind of similar things. We're converted now to this monotheism from polytheism, but we're still keeping their own version of it, to say, okay, we are different from you. We're not exactly the same thing. It's striking how similar such dynamics actually are. So the Kairouites eventually managed to seize Kairouan, actually also pretty early, around 756 AD, and they seemingly weren't an extremely positive domination, and eventually they were expelled by another Kairouite set, because there were so many different groups in here. Everything was very political, especially in Islam. All these currents had a much stronger political orientation. What would happen with, I don't know, the heresies in Christianity, and that also had this political character. But in Islam, this was much more, and especially at these frontiers, everything was much more fluid, much more blurred. So the point I'm making, I guess, is observing how these events contributed to define, however, certain local identities that were, in this sense, properly, in this case, Tunisian, for instance, and that were shaping a sort of local rule on a sort of local basis. Albeit these were now speaking, at least these elites were speaking Arab and were Muslim. Like theoretically, how homogeneously it would have to be in the caliphate, indeed. So Kairouan was newly kind of rebuilt after these clashes, and was occupied once again by the Berbers in 771. Once again it was reoccupied by the caliphs. So this was the city was kind of refounded once again. However, the main fortune of Kairouan would be under the Aghlabites. So this Aghlabite power was very famous. It came essentially was founded. This dynasty was founded by Ibrahim ibn al-Aghlab, so hence the name, who was in fact formerly governor of Ifriqiya on behalf of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the one we mentioned before, the father of Al-Mamun. And at the beginning of the 9th century, the Aghlabite power basically became independent from the caliphs. So it's important because you see here, it's not that these centers were completely detached from the centers of the caliphate, but this is the moment in which the Islamic world was progressively fragmenting. So the centralized positions were extremely interesting to, maybe still maintaining contact with the center to receive, I don't know, a formal sanction of the local rule, and benefiting from also the trade exchanges and so on, but still building something pretty autonomous on a local base. At this point, so in fact, these powers were still recognizing theoretically the sovereignty of the Abbasid caliphs, but they were de facto absolutely free And Kairouan under the Aghlabids reached this zenith, arguably, as it was enriched with monuments. It became a very large economical, intellectual, and religious center. And also in here there was a flourishing study with many scholars whose fame really attracted students from all over the Muslim world. Um, the Aghlabids began to build their own palace in Kairouan. It became also a sort of not just a government but also as a military center. And also in here there was a lot of contact, by the way, in these populations with Black Africa as well. There were lots of Negro slaves that were used as military contingents. So this is also partly the ones that conquered Sicily, as that the Aghlabids were the power that took control of Sicily. This was not an extremely unitary dominion, but still it gravitated around Kairouan as an Aghlabid center. So it's interesting that also there were many residences scattered along Cairo, outside of Kairouan. So there's also a part of detachment from the city proper in order to be a bit more also safer, probably from the local possible, unrest. Sorry. And so on. And this power remained in power until essentially for 1 century, and eventually the area was fell into the hands of Fatimids. And the last Aghlabid stronghold was Kadah. That was one of the centers that was created, one of these residences created by the Aghlabids around Kairouan. The Fatimids wanted, they seized power. They still thought that it was not probably the best center, because they feared, especially once again the Berber reaction and the revival of the Kharijite heresy. So they shifted their center into Al-Madiyya, that is a very narrow landstripe along the Mediterranean coast. And after a certain time they got closer to Kairouan, even if not shifting their residence in there. They also founded other cities around. So this, by the way, was kind of a spin-off of the creating so many other centers around the same Kairouan and building a sort of net of centers on which to establish and power. Kairouan was still kind of flourishing, although the new cities that were founded by the Fatimids were a bit kind of entering into competition with it. And at a certain point, Kairouan was essentially forced to shift all their traffics into the new city of Al-Mansuriya by the same Fatimids. However, the Fatimids, as you know, eventually were destined to rule somewhere else, to shift their center of power into Egypt and into the up to the north towards Syria, etc. So in 972, the Fatimids abandoned, in fact, the Ifriqiya and founding the new Cairo, telling the truth. And there were still certain representatives in the area that were of Berber origin. And this was a very important the moment into which Kairouan could take once again its own prestige, because the local emirs, the Sanhagiya emirs that the Fatimids had left into Ifriqiya to kind of control the area, now basically broke their in the first half of the 11th century their relations with the Fatimids, and this caused a reaction, a Fatimid reaction that basically destroyed, really inflicted a very heavy blow to the prosperity of Ifriqiya. This is a moment to which Kairouan basically begins to decline. This is evidence also from archaeology, because there was the city kind of declined, and now the Berbers were in fact gaining steam against this declining center, and Kairouan got once again fortified to hold these attacks, and it surely Kairouan maintained an importance as a center. I mean, at that time, centers of this size always kind of had their own power on their own, but it were like a kind of independent principality, just like many other cities that were in the area. And there was a moment in which also the Almohads managed to expand from coming from Morocco. They managed to expand their control of this area. So and eventually it's just with the Afsid, the Sultanate al-Afsid, that the Tunisia gained once again its own power. Although at this point Kairouan was not the capital anymore, but Tunis. So this is the main point. Under Afsid Tunisia, the capital was Tunis. This brought, by the way, to certain reactions from Kairouan, as they weren't quite happy. They always tried their best to rebel, both under the Hafsids and eventually also under the Turks later into the modern age. And however, now we're exceeding the limits of medieval history, so we're stopping this. Another extremely important century into the far west in this sense, that because by the way there were many different perceptions also within the same Islamic world of these areas, like areas like Maghreb and Mashrek were definitely perceived as different. There was also of these North Africa was conceived still as a sort of more half pagan world, also from Islamic standards. And even if you look into Christian, into the tradition of chivalry, etc., North Africa is always the land of the magicians, of these kind of occult, obscure forces, of this kind of dreamlike world, while it's very different from and so you can understand where so many shades of this Islamic world that corresponded to different local identities, different and powers remained also very different, because by the way into North Africa, this is more evident into centers like Morocco, in fact, and now we're going to see all these ways of tribesmen from the Atlas Massif that were kind of had an extremely different political vision, also compared to the other great states with a centralized bureaucracy, a professional army, like it could be, I don't know, the Abbasid Caliph, Fatimid Egypt, also actually Umayyad Spain, that was eventually seized by the Almohads, the Almoravids, but that in this sense, yeah, they brought so many different political models. If you take, I don't know, at the beginning of the 16th century, what the political culture of the the of Morocco actually was compared to the one of the Ottoman Empire. It's extremely two very different worlds that were, however, still in contact with each other. This is interesting because Islam maintained the link between all these areas and therefore having various. Also, because theoretically, all these powers were kind of still hierarchically meant. I mean, there was a point in which definitely the Ottoman Empire became this enormous power that extended its control over these minor centers, especially of North Africa, that were sort of client states. The last center I wanted to look at this list is Marrakech. So this is this city of Morocco, famously, and it's at the foot of the northern side of the High Atlas. Even if the also thinking about the climate here is important because it's a kind of continental climate. There are there's a few rains in there, even though there are lots of palm trees all around, and there is also a rather this the area also saw the rise of irrigations at one point, if I'm not wrong. Because there are so many different landscapes. Also, this is important to maintain, to think in the Islamic world. You could find the hottest desert to the coldest glaciers, the steppes, the palm trees, everything really. Think of the marshes of Iraq, or I don't know, the mountains of Afghanistan. I mean, it's so many different climates, so many, and this entail also this kind of augmented also and fueled the encyclopedical knowledge of the Islamic world at this time. That definitely was extremely interesting, and we'll see it later with explorations, with looking at different worlds, different cultures, and so on. So the city was, as far as I know, if I wouldn't be wrong in here, was built by the Almoravids, by the Almoravid Emir Yusuf ibn Tashufin, I believe it's that made of Marrakech his own capital, and this function was maintained under the Almohads, so that Marrakech was enriched by splendid monuments at the time. And eventually the Marinids would bring into the 16th century their government to Fez, and there were certain local vassals that, however, kept essentially making it develop. These sheriffs essentially that maintain also during the modern age, the contemporary age. This is important. Then eventually Marrakech was occupied by the French in 1912. Unfortunately, we have a very few remains of the Marinid times between the 13th and 15th century. There are certain local tombs, especially from the modern times, and beautiful mosques that are also in here were built, and the madraza of Ben Yusuf, also in the 16th century, that were, however, inspired to the Almohad tradition that back in the day had been the main, is kind of very important phase of the history of Morocco. So, looking at these centers, we were saying before the connections that remained between these corners also of this enormous area of the Islamic world, essentially and geographically speaking. So from the 10th century, and this it became, for instance, commonplace to use paper into the Islamic world. That according to the legend, the Arabs learned how to make paper after the Battle of the Talas River in 751 against the Tang Chinese, where they captured a lot of these civilians that were close to the, attached with the army, and they allegedly took from them, learned from them the crafts of how to produce paper, the same paper that in fact from the Islamic world would be exported into Europe, first in Spain, then into Italy, and so on. So paper was extremely important. The Europeans had kind of lost the use of paper during the ages. I talked about it this incidentally into the last video made about the title is the transformation of the West, 3rd to 14th century. Oh, and by the way, no, yesterday more than else, literacy in early medieval Europe, that deals with this, and how during early medieval times the Europeans kind of had much less contacts with the East, so they also run out of papyrus to write, and they began to write on pergamene, on vellum, essentially, in their manuscripts and so on. Paper was much cheaper, and especially in those lands of the this more dry lands of the Maghreb and Mashrek could be preserved much better. This is also why Europe is more humid, so we couldn't maintain paper for a longer time. At least, in fact, even when paper kicked in, it was a much cheaper form of, and this was also more decaying material. Of course, there were plenty of paper manuscripts from medieval times, but let's say that we lost much of the papyrus that was here because it kind of rotted. It got setting in the East. These dry territories kind of also favored the paper as a scripturary support, and this favored extremely the communication. This gave a great impulse to written culture into the Islamic world, and this was, however, already present and favored by the fact that Islam, as just like Christianism and Judaism, is a religion of the book, so that it was necessary to know Arab and writing in order to be able to read the Quran. Yesterday I was discussing the same thing for Christianity in the West. So the importance of monotheism in the history of Eurasia is exactly also related to the production of among other things, naturally, to the production also of written records. I mean, to be able to essentially express yourself through the writing, and not just leaving things, suspense, but trying to fix them, because what you write is not just a personal reflection, but it's also a reflection on the world that God has created, and that has to be studied and preserved. So this is what both the Christians and the Muslims were doing. By the way, the Quran, this is also very important, because the Quran originally could not be translated into other languages. So you necessarily had to know Arab, and this is why Arab, in fact, is present in all these countries that were so different from each other, because it was kind of imposed in order, at least to the elites of those who could write, because definitely not also, just like in Europe, like in the Christian world, in the Islamic world, most of the people here were illiterate. But still, it was very important to maintain it from Arab. So this also developed multilingualism. That's very important to also have a different think about all the translators that existed at this time, and that already existed because, as we have seen, the Arabs themselves from the beginning had come out of Arabia into lands that spoke substantially different languages, and they had to learn things like Greek, mostly to translate from these extremely important works that they found into the Byzantine libraries, and they began to write and to read and to comment, and to needing to expand also their knowledge, their interpretations. Um, the so this unifying factor of the Arab language and also the techniques that were naturally connected with the production and the spread of books were this um, incredible spin-off that managed the Islamic civilization to expand and to diversify also. So the Muslims were at this time mostly interested into scientific literature. So we're talking about treatises of history, of geography, of astronomy, medicine, architecture. These were kind of the most important fields into which the Arabs began to produce, to think. And especially there is also another aspects of the Islamic civilization that is, in fact, we mentioned it before, is the geographical horizons of this world. So the Arab geographers from the 10th to the 11th century were kind of the centuries of peak of Islamic culture in the Middle Ages, knew extremely well the world of their time. They traveled as far as China, the Arctic Pole, equatorial Africa. So just think at the range of not just of actual physical places with different plants, with different animals, with different climates, etc., but also with different populations. We have very interesting sources about the Vikings that were written by the Arabs. And these guys really traveled everywhere, also naturally also thanks to trade. There were probably certain expeditions also aimed to convert the populations to Islam, although Islam mostly expanded, only geographically speaking, paradoxically into the modern age, even surpassing Christianity at that time as rate of conversions. And they naturally noted down all their observations about these places and comparing them with the classical knowledge. And therefore also sticking to this kind of ethnographical, geographical models of the ancient world, and that producing works that are still today kind of the classics of history of explorations. This is so fascinating at many levels because also of another reason that unfortunately we don't know pretty much, and I mentioned it in other times on Schwerpunkt, and I believe it's one of the new frontiers of research in medieval history, also in anthropology or wherever you want. That is the idea that into certain, when the Muslims now expanded into different areas, and even if think about into India, into the Far East, etc., that progressively got Islamicized. I don't know how to say this. I made a video recently about the medieval Southeast Asia that talks about this also, but there is the one about medieval India that deals with this. It's the idea that the Muslims brought with them not just their religion and political models and so on that were imitated by the local elites and so on, but also a lot of knowledge of very, as we've seen, with a very original knowledge in many ways that, however, contained essentially a sum of all different, the legacy of many different civilizations. And one thing that we would like to know especially is how much the Muslims at this point of enormous cultural expansion knew and were studying about the classical knowledge, because not all the classical knowledge that eventually remained in places like Constantinople was actually the integral one that existed before. When the Muslims invaded the Near East, they seized, as we've seen, enormously important cultural centers that all had a huge amount of knowledge. Think about the Library of Alexandria, think about the other centers of, I don't know, like Lebanon or Syria, this that had these extremely important cities and local traditions that in fact were a bit external, because also the Romans had arrived there as foreigners essentially. Then naturally, yeah, the Byzantine Empire had been blended a little bit more with these eastern populations, but there were also into to the Roman Empire so many different local identities. They were the same ones that eventually even brought to open the gates to the Muslims, because I don't know, in Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, they didn't want to pay the taxes to Constantinople anymore, and the Muslims made them pay much less. So the Arabs seized an enormous quantity of classical documents of works that of any type that paradoxically are lost today, because by the way, the Muslim world is much less documented today than the Western one. Like in the West, for evident historical reasons, we kind of intensely studied everything of our history during colonialism. We overexpanded. We started to have a huge amount of research of studies and so on. Regions like the Near East, the Middle East, yeah, arguably, well, first of all, there are many factors that it also brought to also preserving less, perhaps, but also their histories are a bit more difficult to reconstruct, and this is unfortunate, because we see, especially in certain legions and traditions that were associated to the Muslim penetration into places like, in fact, Southeast Asia, etc. There are many, many, many stories, many hints, many traces of knowledge that surely was pre-Islamic, because it dealt essentially with things like even the legions of Alexander the Great and stuff like that. By the way, Alexander the Great had a much greater important in Muslim epics than it had in Christian epics. And in Christian epics, you know, Alexander is during the Middle Ages is a prominent figure as well. But around this figure of Alexander was considered indeed mythical and legendary and enormous. In fact, and this is important to say, into the Muslim world, Alexander the Great has an immense importance, much more than in the West. There were attached many details about certain, I don't know, even to say certain data that revolved more or less around the figure of Alexander as the symbol of an Hellenistic world that contained details about what were probably informations that existed into classical times, about especially explorations and so on, that the Arabs knew and that they paradoxically exported in other region of Asia, but about whose works are the works of which are the original works of which are lost today, but they still survive into those traditions. So sometimes we find knowledge about even talking about geography, the geysers. Now, it is true that the Arabs themselves went to the Arctic pole and they might have figured out, I mean, might have reached, but geysers here seemingly were most likely something that the ancient had already seen, because here we don't have the exact scientific description of a geyser, but there are certain stories in here in these traditions that are talk about this, I don't know, this kind of water that into this icy land that were shot in the air, formed these smokes, the kind of, that's a geyser, come on. And this might have been actually the proof that the ancient explorers went, surely they went in places like the famous the mythical Tula, like it would be modern days Iceland, etc., and have figured out these things. These things were written down into the libraries of the Hellenistic world. They remained in there through the Roman times. The Arabs seized them, they read them, they assimilated them, they built them, they brought them all together with the figure of Alexander, all these mythical past they were extremely fascinated by, and these legends are to be found in places like Southeast Asia, and still bear the memory of those explorers of the ancient world. This is amazing, and I'm no expert about these things at all, but I suspect this more than this specific thing now, the knowledge of the ancient, but think about the syncrasies that existed at this time into a world like the Islamic one that basically had nothing in common but a language and a religion, and into which everything else was diverse, but still framed into this, let's say, theoretically all-encompassing Muslim world. So all these scholars that wrote, that studied, and unfortunately we don't know what their sources were, we don't know where they got information, but this is amazing of the Islamic world, the ability of having got all this knowledge, having made it a sort of original synthesis on their own. And this is incidentally what we got back from in the West, because the Aristotle we studied in Paris in the 13th century was not Aristotle, was Aristotle mediated by the Arabs, with all enormous influences also from Plato, for instance, and all these treatises about, in fact we've seen it, of history, geography, astronomy, medicine, architecture, and so on, were all things that were the result, the mixture of these enormous cultures that we can't put everything, the Hellenistic one, the Persian one, the Indian one, even the Chinese influences, and also these, and even in philosophy, given that there was a huge deal of problem also into the Islamic world of containing the so-called heresies, in the sense that such a diverse world would naturally produce different interpretations of the Holy Scriptures. It would definitely bring to different interpretations of the Quran, of the Hadith. I mean, that's the reason why there are so many different schools of Islam still today, while we have so many differentiations in the Islamic world. They realize the Islamic world is extremely complicated, way more than the Christian one is. The Christian one is kind of unitary in comparison. So all differences that corresponded also to those political fragmentations we were talking about before, that contributed to refine themselves to cope, in order to cope with the others. Because if there had been just a flat, unique empire, centralized, this kind of vitality, this kind of intellectual dynamism, effervescence would have not existed. So maybe this, I don't know, should have been a unique power that stretched from Portugal to India. I mean, the world would be entirely Muslim by this time, probably. There wasn't, fortunately, also because of this thing, because of what it was able, instead of what the political fragmentation of the Islamic world was able to give and to contribute for the history of human civilization. There are naturally so many oh, and by the way, just to finish the point on the Arab explorations, at this time the Arabs were constantly in contact with Europe. I mean, constantly. So also in here, there is no barrier. We don't have to talk about the Islamic world as if it was something radical. They were essentially the same thing. Yes, it's true, the Christians were in the north of the Mediterranean and the Muslims in the south of the Mediterranean, but that's the point. That's the Mediterranean we're talking about. There's a meeting point. People will exchange continuously. And warfare that was episodic never brought an end to this. On the contrary, because this is how also these powers began to understand from one from the other, to develop, etc. So, Pat, today I would like to conclude, even if it's going to take a while still, talking about major figures, also some of the major figures of the Islamic philosophy at this point, to show what's really the cultural influence of Islam was really also for the history of the world. Probably the some of the greatest, you know, figures we can ever naturally think about is the philosopher and medic Ali al-Hussein ibn Sina, that we remember in the West as Avicenna, by transliteration. And I've already discussed about him. I don't remember really where. I think but we never dedicated much to him. Maybe we'll do something more in detail some other time. But he was born in the surroundings of Bukhara in 980. So that world we were talking about before, an extremely syncretic world. Here, he was born in Afsana, this place around Bukhara, and he died eventually in Hamadan in 1037. So there are many also in here about these figures. We know obviously a lot about their work and so on, but sometimes it's difficult to trace their real historical figure, because telling the truth, we are plenty of informations about them, but most of them are traditional. So it's kind of also of the importance that these people kind of assumed into the Islamic world, how they were thought, perceived, conceived. So we have this a bit also in the West, that we have a certain figure that we want to picture intellectually in a certain way because we want to adapt it to our own view of the thing. This happened a lot of time into the Islamic world. And there are a lot of legends, and also because these were highly admired figures at the time, independently from the various say controversies that their thoughts could arise, because they were saying before, these also had their own interpretation and their own opinions of the world, etc. So, but it is normally said that that Avicenna was an extremely precocious student, so that he allegedly he would basically already assimilate everything from the of all the works that existed into the great cultural centers of Bukhara when he was already only 18 years old. And we don't have to be surprised, because obviously sometimes great geniuses in history that have been also maybe pictured as such. But if you think about how the knowledge worked at the time, it was something much less framed, much less standardized like it's our own today, and it was by certain standards also harsher. Education at that time was something that mostly had to do with how gifted you were. That was the real selection. Let's say the idea, if you were a smart person, you were essentially sent to study because you were seen as a profitable opportunity for yourself, for your family, the society, and so on. So even at the time, naturally, there weren't computers, and in order to learn, you had essentially to learn everything by heart. This is something it's extremely difficult to conceive for us today, because today we just have everything one click away, so our brain is used not to do anything else by its own. These people had to learn everything by heart. I mean, an average, let's say, religious scholar of the Middle Ages knew in Christianity the Bible, in Islam the Quran by heart. And I don't know if you've ever read the Bible by extent. I've never read the Quran by extent, but if you have an idea of how long the Bible is, you realize you say this is not possible. Well, this was possible, as a matter of fact. These people knew these texts and many other more by heart. And obviously these were not average people, obviously, but it was another way the brain was used to learn, and these people knew so many things at once. And this is kind of also of an empowering belief, because, for instance, I don't know, when I learn something new, I feel so proud about it. But not because I want to show off other people, but it's because I say, oh my god, I have this knowledge, it's so precious. It's as if you had it, you could sense it in your mind, as if it was even a plastic material thing. Just think about knowing what was known, and say, amazing, amazing. And you can't say, well, at the time there was much less to know, because as we've seen, I wish you had gone into, I don't know, into the House of Wisdom of Baghdad into the 9th century, and tell me if you could learn all that was present in there. It would have taken you 50 lives to do something like that. But aside from this, Avicenna had this also relatively tormented life, telling the truth, both of familiar and political nature, so that he didn't actually fully spend his life studying. He was a pretty lively man, or at least he was, however, pretty much committed to the world of the time. This is another thing we tend to forget a lot, especially when we have this classicistic perspective. When you study history of literature, you study figures like, I don't know, from medieval literature, there is this filthy classicism that stresses the fact that it's only the poet, the writer, and so on. But most of these people at the time were actually much more than that. I mean, if you take a figure like Dante Alighieri, it was not just a guy you have to imagine sitting somewhere with a pen in his hands and writing. This man had been a politician, he had been a magistrate, he had been a knight who fought in the first line and even risked his skins in there. He was an extremely worldly man. This is the term, worldly man. These were worldly men. They knew a lot, not just about theory and abstract knowledge, but about the real practice of life at the time, political and social life. And especially, you have to understand, in this sense, these Christian or Muslim thinkers as extremely committed, also for strictly religious reasons, because knowledge at that time was one thing with a religion. There was no thing like a free thinking. Even the most I don't know, the freest minders, those who were even too falsely assimilated to atheism, where people were still posing themselves an ethical problem deriving from the religious background they were being born, and this they had been educated, and this is what really pushed much of this theological and scientifical and education, because it was felt as a moral duty. This is a key concept you have to understand about the Middle Ages. The word was not studied because it was just a pure objective scientific interest. It was really meant to be as a symbol of that the divine had created for you. So your achievements as a scientist were let's say subordinated to this, and not just at a prescribed level, because you truly believed such a thing. Avicenna had, for instance, extremely important and serious and public duties. In order to make a living, he had to exercise the profession of doctor. So also here, pretty practical reasons for which also expanding in such fields and so on. And if you look at this, at the corpus of the Avicennian works, you realize it's enormous. We're talking about something like 130 works, even more actually. And unfortunately, great part of this has been lost. These are the things that really make you say, damn. But of what we know, um, it's essentially a I don't know even how to call it, because it's pretty weird, kind of an essay, about his, Avicenna's knowledge. And he even used to write in certain very uncomfortable conditions. He was often traveling, and he didn't even, in that sense, he didn't even bring all of his books with him. So this is why before I was stressing the importance of learning things by heart at this time, because it was sometimes not even physically possible at the time to bring together with yourself all the books you needed. Now I have an hard disk with like 9,000 books. I can access them where I like. I can even take it with me if I've ever had to do it. These guys couldn't, and at the time, even having hundreds of books was an extraordinary thing to be. So to be capable of having in first place, also because the books costed a fortune at the time, but also because indeed knowledge was really power, and still is, by the way, in part at least, because it gives you an intellectual edge that is something you have to be able to use in order to cope with problems, to deal with them, and so on. Definitely Avicenna is one of the greatest thinkers of all times. Definitely, I don't know other terms of how to define him. As we were saying before, he was actually pretty faithful to the especially to the educational and cultural Islamic principles. This is why before I was saying never think about these people as free thinkers. There was no, especially in the West, sometimes we have looked at these figures in the Islamic world by trying to, saying, okay, these guys were so intelligent, so similar to us from a modern perspective, that we have to stress the fact that they were laymen, or they were even atheists. Nothing more false. And this is sadly something we do even with our own Christian thinkers, like saying things like, I don't know, that if a person was interested about science into the Middle Ages, was probably less of a Christian. We have to stress this inexplicable incompatibility between theism and science and knowledge. Nothing more false. On the contrary, probably it was a much greater commitment and much greater interest and understanding towards religion by those who actually studied more and could actually understand what religion was. Because let's erase from our minds that by talking about the Middle Ages in the Christian or Islamic world, the majority of the people actually understood Christianity or Islam. It's absolutely, respectively, it's absolutely false. Leaving aside what the other perceptions of the two things were, like in the Middle Ages to medieval Europe, people believed that Muhammad was a sort of schismatic bishop, a Christian bishop, in fact, that had gone. But this is still interesting because it makes you understand also how so much about the mindset of what these of these people that otherwise in fact were capable of producing such amazing works at the same time, works that are still so important for us, indeed, because they were the basis of our things like mathematics, geometry, like algebra, geometry, and I don't know, natural science, music, astronomy. We should be a bit more thankful, a bit less judgmental towards our, for the people who came before us, let's say. There are two works that are the canon, so the canon eventually in Latin, and the Kitab al-Shifa, in Latin the Liber Sufficientiae, that were known, translated, and extremely studied into the West, so that they remained eventually to be the basis of medical science into Europe. Excuse me. Avicenna created a very important and, I would say, genial synthesis of the theories of Aristotle with the medical ones of Hippocrates. And it was Avicenna that what we were talking about before. It was enriching enormously Aristotelic thought with Neoplatonic elements. It was, in this sense, a very important influence also, not just because these works were read and eventually they caused the scholastic to happen into the 13th century, because of, Avicenna's works were studied in Europe, and the church had to find a way to cope with this new, let's say, apparently perfect philosophical system that it eventually needed to integrate into the Christian philosophy. But also because, in this sense, through the work of Avicenna, there were elements within Aristotelian works that were kind of closer to part of the Platonism that already existed into the Christian world, and that was in fact integrated into the Aristotelian thought. So that the Europeans also managed to, the Western Christians to integrate this system, thanks to also this part of the similarities that they found with certain Platonic thoughts that were developing on their own, because in Western Europe, essentially, it was mostly Plato, through also St. Augustine, that had survived as a root as the main philosophical root. It's only in this period, the 12th, 13th century, that Aristotle is associated to. So definitely the Neoplatonic elements in Avicenna's Aristotle's Avicenna, Avicenna's Aristotle were so influential also for the development of same Christian scholastics. And Avicenna is an extraordinary figure we couldn't really ever stop talking about. He was mostly known, by the way, at the time through the translation that Gerard of Cremona did. I discussed about this when dealing with the translations from Latin. The title here is of the video, if you're interested, is 12th century Western translations from Greek and Arabic, that deals with the problem. But I also made another thing before that was kind of interesting. Scientifical revival of the West, 10th, 13th century, a point of medieval technology. That also deals with these points. And eventually this was Gerard translated, especially the canon, the canon of medicine. Eventually, it was printed into Arab for the first time only in 1593 Rome. And eventually, with this, actually the Latin version of Gerard of Cremona that dates to the 12th century was perfected by Alpago in Renaissance Venice. So this work, as we've seen, was essentially a synthesis to but why is it so great? Because it's systematically ordered the medical doctrines of Hippocrates and Galenus with Aristotle's biology. So this was partly, it's being criticized also as sort of a critical, as a theoretical work, but this is not really the point. I mean, this is the ability of having assimilated such systems and being able to basically integrate them, the one with the other, and making an hybrid of them. So Avicenna wrote also as we have seen, an enormous quantity of other works that unfortunately were lost, and they had mostly a kind of an encyclopedical character. This is also very interesting because it reflects the systematization of knowledge on a kind of a ordered way that is kind of the one that resembles the way also Islamic libraries were ordered in a way. So, and this also came from it's an Hellenistic legacy, and it was meant to give an order to the world that was naturally also framed into the religious vision of the world. And these were works, as we've seen, about music, algebra, geometry, astronomy, natural sciences, and there are also other works like treatises. There is the let's say the one Ash shift, that actually means the healing from the mistake. That is this there is actually a very vast encyclopedical philosophy, and in the West there were several parts of it that were translated. So the metaphysics, the physics, the sky and the world, the soul and the animals. So this was a work that aimed, in fact, to this at reaching a sort of orthodoxy through knowledge. So healing your inner soul also through the intellectual activity. And this was very important. It was also not a new as a concept, is another classical legacy, but in here was adapted also in here to another religion. There is the Eastern philosophy, the Ikma Marishikiya, and there are so many other little works that have a mystical and exoterical nature, and there are works that have been written also in Persian that have to do with also mostly certain philosophical doctrines. And however, also in here Avicenna was mostly about Aristotle mixed with Neoplatonism, and trying to also from the Muslim side, like it would happen for the scholastics in the West. Avicenna tries to integrate, to reconcile it with the Asharita, that is essentially the Orthodox Muslim theology. And from Al-Farabi, that we'll discuss also in a while, he derived the emanatistic cosmogony. So also absorbing this philosophical mysticism that, by the way, was typical of Neoplatonism, because it was actually Plotinus that at the time was, I believe, thought still to be, at least in the Western world, but I think also in the Eastern one, to be Plato himself. So this theory of emanatism, for which how to justify, the bad things happening in the world. This concept of God emanating and being, and nature being kind of a halfway between, an imperfect thing, an imperfect emanation that hence explains the evil. At least this is how Plotinus justified the thing. Then I don't really know what Avicenna says, but so there is also this concept that the world is co-eternal to God, and that at least in potential there are eternal possibilities of the world that are contained into God, that being this eternal, necessary, unique being gives to the matter that is in this sense increated and eternal those powers that are able to paradoxically to things that are able to realize other powers practically. And there is this hierarchy of degrading intermediate beings that are obviously always less perfect, because only God is perfect, and he goes against the contact with he's adverse to the contact with matter. This is very important because also in the West we have with the Bogomils, these were doctrines that existed actually since the millennia. But in the same time into Europe, you realize that exactly in the same centuries there is Bogomilism, and also into the Western world progressively certain movements, radical movements that stress, in fact, like the Cathars, at least in part, the idea that matter is evil, that only the soul should survive. So this was bringing also to enormous theological problems, because they were denying the physical nature of Christ, the holiness of the cross. The being made of matter was something negative in practice. So it's interesting to see how across the Western world, the Byzantine world, the Islamic world, there were theories. There was a circulation of theories that were actually pretty much similar in many ways, and that all had more ancient roots, but that now were being rethought, re-elaborated in different ways. So this idea that also the skies were at many levels of that corresponded to several levels of intelligence, of knowledge, something you find also in Dante's Commedia. When Dante goes in, the whole system is seen as this thing, that hell is the most material world. Instead, when the more you go towards the top, into the skies, there are pure spirits. Essentially, address these forms of enlightenment that have to head towards the pure knowledge, pure truth of God. So also in here, many syncretic aspects between Christianity and Islam in certain philosophical conceptions. And there were naturally every sphere, or celestial sphere, also corresponded to more specific elements. Now we don't have the time to look at. And the human soul is seen naturally as being influenced by the greater, let's say, the universally unique intellect of God. This is also in part Aristotle. And what is important also in here is showing how knowledge gets into the place. I mean, this relation between the various celestial spheres has to do also with intelligence, practice, and knowledge as such. And this is the point, and it's really, in fact, from Augustinian thought it was the prevalent in Western Europe, and Avicenna's thought, that we find this major conciliation of Neoplatonism between the two currents. So, as we were saying, these were similar chords that were kind of playing in harmony and had been developing into different areas of Eurasia in relatively the same direction, could be, say, synthesized. Other very important protagonists of the Muslim scientific culture that also in here re-elaborated the classical knowledge and adding many contributions also from the Persian, especially Indian and Chinese world. The Persians were extremely influential in all this. Persia has always had an enormous cultural influence on in the Islamic world, and also the Abbasid caliphs were essentially in their universalistic models were essentially drawing heavily from Persia, even more than from the Roman Empire. Also, certain visions of power, of cosmology, of the relations between the deity and and mankind were influenced by things like other religions, like Zoroastrianism, for instance, that among the Muslims was actually pretty much tolerated at this time because it was recognized as a monotheism and a religion of the book. Even though it was not an Abrahamic religion, still it was highly respected by both the Christians and the Persians because it was felt as something, grand, magnificent, impressive, and could it could be interpreted partially as there were certain things that this religion had in common to the other monotheism, Abrahamic monotheisms, so that it could be partially, not really integrated, but at least there could be a sort of osmosis of models also, especially concerning the political theory, because the great Persian monarchy had developed since millennia, in fact, this concept of power, this vision of power, of derivation of earthly power from the divinity. So these were all things that were pretty much useful for, especially for the caliphs, to impose their own, to absorb and to re-elaborate in their own Muslim version of the story, I say. So another thing in here, another extremely important figure that is at the base of modern science is, for instance, Jabir ibn Hayyan. That is this figure that is really even a bit I think of a mythical figure, telling the truth. He is being for centuries considered the founder of medieval alchemy, and he had also here an enormous fame in Europe. The and the and this in fact emerged from two different historical figures. That was the astronomer Jabir ibn Afla and the alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan. So also in here it's a problem that partially existed also because of problems of translation. That in the West these names were translated, but nobody had a probably clear figure of who these were, so it was pretty easy to mix up the two things. And also in here it seems that the origin was in the northeast of Persia, in the Khorasan, mm, and that, however, lived in so this historic, say, pseudo-historical figure that he eventually lived, it would have lived according to Al-Kufa in Mesopotamia, um, so a little bit west of the southern Euphrates, and he allegedly had certain masters, like he was living into essentially into the 8th century, to the end of the 7th, beginning of the 8th century. So um, the the importance of this figure is that was allegedly, in fact, um, educated by an Umayyad prince, Khalid ibn Yazid, and also the 6th Shia Imam, Jafar al-Sadiq. That is this kind of very important also figure of Shia, also from a cultural point of view, because you know that Shiism has this kind of exoteric view of the world that also was this typically influenced by certain other Persian, or at least that it blended quite easily into certain Persian vision of the world. And in fact, this Imam is kind of a legendary figure as well. So, given to this, Jabir would have lived into the first half of the 8th century, and in fact, the only knowledge about his life, assuming he ever existed, are to be found into Arab authors that were essentially studying his own works, in always given that these were authentical. And in fact, already in the 10th century, many Arab authors already believed that he was a sort of an imaginary character, and that if he ever existed, he probably wrote only one book, that was the Book of Mercy, and and however, there were still at that point still so many works that circulated under his name, essentially, and these were mostly about alchemy and medicine. So it is actually possible that this figure existed in some way, but it's really difficult to define, to know what he was, what he actually wrote. And there were also in here many philosophical and religious problems, given the cultural influences that it received also from the Shia, etc. And but now we can't go into detail. The most important thing is this author, however, the works of Jabir were known into medieval Spain, and from there, essentially, they were known. They spread into Europe, into the rest of Europe. Excuse me, I'm extremely tired at this point. So this, whatever, we can stop it here. Maybe just remembering the other great thinker, Al-Kharizmi, that we discussed in other videos. The great mathematician from which the West got the world algorithm from Al-Kwarizmi, actually. So it's not another. It's not actually. There's nothing etymologically related to the term, to the meaning, let's say. And so this, in the sense, algorithm and this algebraic operation. This was Al-Kharizmi was another. In fact, as the name says, actually he was called Muhammad ibn Musa Al-Kwarizmi, and he was also in here, coming from a Persian environment. He died in the mid of 10th century. Was mathematician. Also in here, he was a polymath, an astronomer, geographer, and chronographer. He lived in Baghdad most of his time, He studied Ptolemy, his geography, on the basis of a Greek text. He wrote a treatise on algebra with certain astronomical tables as well next. That came incidentally also from certain with an explicative text based on a of an Indian treaty of astronomy. So here you see these Muslims putting all together what they found from the various cultures they enter in contact with. And his most important treatise as we said, is the one on algebra, and he so at the point that his author would become the same name for the scheme of calculus that we use as algorithm. And he doesn't go beyond squared equations, but this, it was the algebraists of the Bolognese school into the 16th century that went beyond. But up to that point, through the whole Middle Ages, even remaining on Euclides and Diophantus, and therefore essentially being based also in here on the classical notions, Al-Kharizmi made an enormous effort of original elaboration, and this brought, in fact, to his importance throughout all this time, and his texts were to expand also here in the West as a model basing on modern algebra practically. Al-Farabi, also that we named before, is one of extremely famous Muslim philosopher, mathematician, and medic. And he was born also in here. In fact, his name was actually Abu Nasr Muhammad, and Al-Farabi actually is another toponym in practice, because he was born in Wazig in the territory of Farab, in fact, in Turkestan. So also in here, they were coming all from this extremely vivacious world that we've seen between Bukhara and Samarkand, in this region of the north of Persia, essentially. And he was born around 870 and died in Damascus in 950. He translated and commented Porphyrius and the Organon of Aristotle. He wrote a scientific treatise known as the Ortus Scientiarum into its Latin translation. One on the intellect was translated into Latin as the Intellectu and et Intelligibili, that is practically on the intellect and what is intelligible. And he wrote also in here countless works of maths, astronomy, medicine, alchemy, music, ethics, politics, and so on. And the Al-Farabi's work basically represents probably the first attempt of organical formulation of the Arab thought as such, and he was in fact so important for the same Avicenna and Averroes eventually. He also in here, as we've noted with Avicenna, for instance, that he had tried to reconcile Aristotelianism with, or at least to have commixtions of Aristotelianism with Neoplatonism. Well, Al-Farabi was just the same. He actually taught these principles, and he wrote, in fact, a work on the harmony between Plato and Aristotle. And he basically managed to reconcile the Platonic thesis according to which the world has a principle, and the one according to which the Aristotelian one, that the world is not generated practically. So the so he got to the idea that basically the world came out of nowhere, literally, and out of nothing, and by a single atemporal or intemporal act of God. Mm? And that it's exactly from this act that time started, essentially. Um, the the according to intellect, there is a sort of divine emanation of active intellect, according to Al-Farabi. And aside from and next to this, there are three other forms of intellect, substantially. One is essentially the one that exists in power. The one in power, in act, and acquired intellect, substantially. So and the first one, the one in power, for the action of acting intellect, passes into act. So the act eventually passes into let's say the third form of intellect instead elaborates other notions that are acquired, and that are known by the one in act, so by the second. Well, it's very complicated. I'm sorry, I'm really extremely exhausted now. I should quit it before I say something more stupid. But so the ultimate idea of this is that the activity of human conscience derives, in theory, from the action of the active and creating intellect. So it all comes from God in practice. So I'm exhausted. I don't know what else I could add. There are naturally, talking about the cultural importance of the Islamic world at this time, there is an extremely important scientific literature that, as we've seen, was expanding far and wide, but in parallel with it there was an enormous quantity of smaller thinkers, or minor thinkers, let's say better, that however were also in part the sap of the Islamic civilization at this time. So lots of poets, of writers of novels, and so even of popular origin. All these traditions and tales and stories that existed into among the local populations that, as we've seen, came from extremely diverse backgrounds, and that basically made of Muslim civilization at the time the most cultured and advanced of all Eurasia and Mediterranean. So eventually, during the 12th century, especially thanks to the School of Translators of Toledo, that was born under the headship of the King of Castile, and I dedicated a video to this. The title is it was always 12th century Western translations from Greek and Arabic. Okay, so from this school, there was essentially a full freedom and harmony in the collaboration between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars, so that the Muslim knowledge was able to transmit to our West, and think about the scholastics. That is definitely the probably most important chapter, but generally think at all the development of universities and at the scientific, technological development of the West that surely doesn't owe the majority of this to the sheer informations that came from the East, because this is what I've tried to explain naturally, as there were other premises that brought to such kind of revolution, we can say. But the point is that the Muslim thought was a great spin-off from the same Western one, and that entered into contact with such works that were enormously appreciated and researched, so that it was the same Europeans that sometimes went in the East for taking these books and bringing them back to Europe and translating them and using them for what they need. So not actually a passive reception of these works, of this knowledge, but actually the will of a civilization to study, to learn. And this is probably perhaps the greatest point of contact between the Christian and Muslim civilizations in history. And this is really the one of the most important chapters of the Middle Ages. I don't know how often I will come back on the topic, but let's say it's extremely important to understand, to assimilate as a concept. And we'll try to maybe stop now because I'm exhausted. So for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.